I think coming off a moment of great inspiration, how an idea can actually take shape, become something that is functional and useful to the multitude. So that is the spirit in which we'll have this conversation, and that is in fact the spirit of NEP also. If you were to look at the core essence, it is about a reimagination of what education means, especially from an indigenous lens. So while this comes up, what does what does all of this sound like? Just when we think about curriculum, content, ideas, any thoughts first off of the mind? Do we see that if this is happening in psychology, any thoughts on what could be an adjacent discipline where this is possible? Architecture, sports. All right, sports is an interesting one. Any other possibilities that we are able to imagine at this time, where if you were to think about a 2-year program or a master's, or let's say an undergrad program of 4 years according to new vision, what are the areas in which we can actually think about some efforts or some kind of direction? Indian aesthetics based on Natya Shastra, that seems a very, very important possibility. Social sciences is the most critical one, and we've got to get there, absolutely. Right? For that, in fact, I'll touch upon this a little bit. I think there are two kinds of work that needs to happen. One is the meta theory itself, right? The meta philosophy of social sciences, and how would an Indic lens on social sciences look like? Would we call it social science? Is it separate? Is it disparate? I think there are a lot of essential questions that we'll bring up when we think about it. But there is no question that unless we are able to tackle that, whatever else we are doing in adjacent disciplines, it's not going to be enough. Right? So clearly, it has an asymmetric kind of impact. I will. It is not just an imagination, and it is an incredibly urgent intervention that needs to be made. Just a month ago, and I think this center, the IKS Center at IIT Kharagpur, also did a 2-day seminar on Ayurveda. And the whole idea of integrative medicine, about synthesizing some of the things that we can learn from the Western sciences, but the philosophy of medicine and the idea of Purusha, the treatment of the whole, coming from Ayurveda and yoga is absolutely critical. There is no question about it. That is actually the most essential thing for well-being right now. And I'll talk about it a little bit in terms of crisis of ethics that we have in research and science. Any other disciplines that come to our mind where the next work for IKS in terms of building a theory, building a discipline, building curriculum, building in courses? So that entire, actually history is one area where there is a lot of work happening from outside of academia as well. Professor Jayasyan, of course, made a seminal contribution with his book on the Aryan invasion theory. But there is a lot of work happening outside of academia as well on history. If you look at Vikram Sampatji's works, if you look at Sai Deepakji's works, there is a tremendous amount of consciousness that has seeped in the last 4 or 5 years. And I think academia can take that forward and translate that into specific courses and curriculum and textbooks. Management and leadership development. Unless we have an Indian theory of leadership development and a way to actually translate that into a course and a specific outcome-based intervention, everything else that we do is an act of leadership. So it is important that you make that the foundation. Yes? Brilliant. I think law is, again, I keep saying this, but again, the point is that everything weaves into the next one. There is no difference when you look at from an Indic drishti. Law cannot be different from well-being, it cannot be different from leadership, it cannot be different from social sciences. But since we are in a certain structure, using the fundamental integrative lens, we'll still have to apply that in specific areas like law. Yeah, all aspects of law. What would be the principle of Apaurishaya look, what does that look like when you contrast that with the IPR law right now, right? These are all, if we had to think about PhD thesis, if we had to think about the new emergent kind of questions that need to be answered by IKS, once we exercise our thought in that direction, there are just, any number of topics that actually become research topic, right? Cool. I think that was just some fodder for thought. So this whole the spirit of today is all about imagination and how we are able to think about new disciplines and new frontiers using the vision that we've had in the last 14 days. But let's examine this a little bit more structured in a more structured format, particularly with the lens of NEP, and what does technology do to aid this process? Right? So there are two questions. One is, of course, the intent, the leadership, the manifestation of that. But once you have that, you also need to strategize. Just the way Richaji was able to collaborate with 25 different scholars of eminence to give us that curriculum. What are the different kind of collaborations we need to stitch, and what are the new relationships that teachers need to form? That is the basis of what we're trying to imagine in the next 30-40 minutes. But I will begin once again by going to a couple of statements which I think capture our essential condition today. This is Sri Aurobindo talking, I think, in 1945. Says, mankind is undergoing an evolutionary crisis in which is concealed a choice of its destiny. This is a very, very potent statement. I want us to reflect on this for a minute. It is going through an evolutionary crisis. I'll unpack that a little bit in terms of why is he calling it an evolutionary crisis. But he's also saying in that evolutionary crisis is an opportunity. It is actually a choice. It means that he's saying the agency is with us. The crisis is upon us, and this was way back in 1945. In fact, if anything, it has been exacerbated multifold today. And I will allude to a few examples of what this means. But he is making a seminal observation, like he always did, about the future, because his work was at that level. His work was essentially about preparing planet and the human consciousness for the next level of evolution. So he is talking about it from an evolutionary perspective. What does this mean? Any natural sciences faculty here? Anybody from biology? Okay. So if anybody who studied evolutionary biology or the theory of evolution, you would know that, if we were to just speculate on what was it before creation. Of course, the Indian mind has a certain speculation and a theory about it, but from an evolutionary perspective, before there was life, there was a random agglomeration of some materials and some chemicals. At some point in time, the fundamental, what we call the fundamental soup, the chemical soup that can create life, came together. And then that led to a single cell unicellular organism. The first cell was born. And the first cell decided to multiply. It became complex. It became the architecture of life. And then life evolved into more and more complex forms. This is the evolutionary theory as we understand it. There is a lot more. I'm trying to distill it for essence. But he's talking about this as an evolutionary crisis. Now, what has happened in this process of evolution, especially as we look at from the time of Homo sapiens onwards, when we started becoming self-aware a little bit. This has been a journey of self-awareness that is seeded by the formation of a self-reflexive ego, which separated our identity from the rest of the creation. So if you look at all the progress from there, it is a progress on two dimensions. On one dimension, you have this entire feeling of us versus nature, because you are able to see yourself as separate. But your racial memory, your DNA memory, your cultural memory also points to that point of oneness, because you have come from that. If you look at the human behavior, and if you look at civilizations built on certain kinds of definitions, you will see this very, very starkly. On one hand, we started building tools, we started building some kind of fences around us, because evolutionary race has not given humans a physical advantage. You're clearly not as fast as a cheetah, you're not as powerful as an elephant, you're not, you don't have the capacity to fly like birds. We do not have any of these advantages. Tagore writes about this when he talks about religion of man and moving away from religion of God in some senses. He speaks about that. At what point in time did evolution decide that you don't need eyesight to actually have a vision backwards? Because you can be attacked from behind. What is that evolutionary advantage by not having that? When did spine become erect? What is that advantage that we had? So these are some questions that scientists and people who engage in evolutionary biology and evolutionary theory have contended with. But in this journey, we've gone down these two paths. On one path is this complexity that we have to deal with as being separate and distinct, and a recognition of our individuated ego. In that sense, you are in some ways against nature. But it is also in us to be altruistic. If you answer that question that Tagore has posed, why we didn't have that, it is because at some point in time we also realized the power of collaboration. It is at some point in time we realized in a awareness section, not just as normal, as being intuitive about it, but even as our individuated egos, we understood the power of collaboration, the power of myth, the power of being able to form larger associations, the power of trust, the power of altruism. That's what he points to as the next stage of evolution. Tagore does that, and Sri Aurobindo is talking about this in 1945, that what has happened in this twin journey is that we've made the world so complex. On one hand, you have your intuitive mind, you have your intuitive knowledge systems. On the other hand, you have the analytical knowledge systems. And this seems to be a disjointed effort. And when you index on the idea of individuated self and you go too much into the analytical, the tool making mode, you create a civilization which is always ring fenced. You're trying to gain an advantage. That is why the idea of competition, the idea of creating systems which are self-sustained within themselves but are not codependent on anything else, that is the structure that you give eventually to your society and to the civilization itself. So the crisis that he's talking about it is that in that journey you made the world so complex that you are no longer in a position based on your own evolutionary journey of your mind to deal with it. So we've reached a point where we've designed complex systems which we cannot deal with ourselves. But he is not leaving it at there. It is not a fatalistic statement. He's saying in this crisis is an opportunity that is hidden. It's a choice. What is the choice that he's talking about? The choice that he is talking about is that the one index that we made, which is the analytical, the competitive, the outward going kind of exposition. The other dimension is the next stage of evolution, which is an evolution in consciousness. In fact, his entire life was about making sure that we are capable of downloading that consciousness. So the next evolution, and this is what he calls as suprahuman or superman, whatever it is in different forms, is that there is going to be an evolutionary leap, and that evolutionary leap is going to be internal. And this, if you are able to understand, if you are able to identify with it, the answer for why IKS becomes obvious. If the next stage of evolution is going to be an internal one, it is going to be about consciousness, it is about contemplation, it is about awareness. Where is the tradition of that knowledge? Where are the examples, the best examples of people who are embodied with that kind of consciousness? Where is that civilization which has the continuity to manage both the intuitive mind and the analytical mind? Where is that tradition of knowledge? What is that system of knowledge? So when we talk about Indian knowledge systems, the philosophy of education, the philosophy and vision of why we are here, it is because there is an existential crisis. And I will try and locate some examples of this. We can create a typology of what this crisis is, right? So he says the evolution of mind working upon itself or life has developed the organization of activity and use of matter which can no longer be supported by human capacity without an inner change. So we spoke about complexity in the morning, complexity science, it's an evolving field. Complexity science is about how do you deal with the rate of change in the environment around you. Do we feel this in our own way? Do we feel very, very caught? There is an economic system, something happens somewhere in the world, and we say that there are going to be job losses in India. Think about a student joining academia today, taking a 4-year course. Think about the kind of vulnerabilities that they have to deal with. Day in and day out, that person is hearing that you don't know what the world is going to be in the next 4 or 5 years. We are talking about chatbots, we are talking about GPT 3.0, we are talking about automation, we are talking about Industrial Revolution 4.0. I was lucky, I was an average student who got into the job market in 2001 based on very, very normal kind of results that you would get. And I still had the possibility of a career because there was a rising tide that was lifting all boats. My empathy for the students today comes because my own generation has actually complicated this process through the choices that we've made. And therefore, we also have the responsibility to try and set it right. So what is this crisis that we are talking about and how can we set it right? There are 3 crises. One is the crisis of ethics. Somebody spoke about, you mentioned that health and well-being is an area of intervention. I want us to reflect on what really happened in the last 3 years, what we call the COVID pandemic. We have walked into such a trap without actually understanding the forces at play. There is a lot of research now. How many of you have taken the third dose, for example? I'm sure first two doses most of us have. But by the time it was, it was time for the third dose, we said, hang on, it does not seem right. Why should I take it every 6 months? That was still science. That was still recommended. Booster dose was recommended. Now, what is the structure which has broken this trust? Why are we not able to trust what is being told to us through public institutions? And in my discussion with you on the art of governance, the very purpose of knowledge, the sum total of all knowledge is Yogakshema, is well-being. This is the Indian philosophy. Knowledge has to serve Yogakshema. Has science served that in the last 3 years? As academicians who have the responsibility of finding truth and only abiding by truth, we have to ask ourselves, have we bought out truth in our full capacity? We don't trust the media, we don't trust the doctors, we can't trust the public institutions. There is a crisis of trust. And that is because there is a crisis of ethics. And in any society, who is responsible for upholding the ethics? It is the teacher. The entire purpose of a teacher of learning is to actually set the standard for the society to follow. Right? Now, this crisis, if you understand, the crisis of ethics in research, if you unpack it a little bit more, you would see the systemic, the architecture of mistrust. Who is sponsoring research today? In the Western world, and I don't know the statistic for India, in some ways we don't even get the statistics, so we don't even understand if there is a problem, we don't even probe enough. 85% of all research, particularly medical research, is funded by institutions that are not public interest institutions. Think about the pharmaceutical industry. If they sponsor the research, any public policy 101 will tell you that incentives play a huge role. What is the incentive for an industry which is benefiting from disease to sponsor research about disease? They will necessarily have to tell you that there is a bigger danger and posit themselves as the solution. It is not about individual morality, and it is not about discounting science. There are any number of honest scientists. Clearly, they have done a brilliant job in trying to get us some kind of solution. It is not even for a minute to belittle that. But we also know in our own real experience that science has not served humanity in the last 3 years. That is because it has a certain structure. It could not speak the truth. Do we feel it? In fact, just today, if you look at a lot of new revolutions that are coming on, you will see that there was in fact a first aid treatment that was decent, that was good, that was available to us at much cheaper rates without any of this disruption. If you have the philosophy of Ayurveda, if you understand the philosophy of well-being from an Indian knowledge system perspective, you would immediately be able to see through this scam. But you don't have the pedestal. You don't have the ability to go out and say, this is the way to think about well-being. Well-being is not about disease control alone. It is about a holistic way to think about mind, body, soul, society. It is systems, it is soul, it is society. So we have a crisis of ethics because structurally your research is sponsored by people in whose interest it is not for you to actually come out with truth. So therefore there is for the teachers to reclaim their own position as the torchbearers of truth, as the purveyors of truth, you need to engage with IKS in that spirit. So that's the first statement I would like to make. Second is, we've spoken about this, so I won't belabor, but what is the dominant, we talk about consumption-ridden solutions or consumption-ridden problems. Everything is framed as consumption-ridden, right? We say sustainability is a challenge. When did and how did sustainability become a challenge? What does it really mean? In real terms, what does it mean? It means that the rate of extraction from nature and the rate of consumption is far outpacing the rate of production by nature. Nature needs, soil needs, for example, a certain kind of time for regeneration. Look at your own human body. What happens when you don't get sleep? What is the process of sleep? You regenerate. That's why when you get up in the morning, you're once again ready for the day ahead. If you do not have that regeneration and if you continue to extract, it obviously means that you're not sustainable. At some point, nature is going to give up. And nature giving up is not about us. We are really puny. It just needs a little flip from the nature and all of these things will be gone. What was COVID? It was just a small virus. How many of us did it throw out of gear? The entire world. So when we talk about ecology, when we talk about sustainability, we are not talking about saving nature. We are talking about being responsible to have life for ourselves, for our own next generation. But the challenge here is, the psychological challenge here is that we are all persuaded by our own worldview to make choices. And those choices govern our consumption as well. Now, if your worldview comes from an idea of the self that you only live once, then the natural outcome of that is what is called as FOMO, fear of missing out. How many of you have heard this term? All of us have heard. We are all internet beings now, that we've all experienced it very deeply. We do. That is natural. It's not, it is de facto. So if the challenge is that you have to be able to delay gratification, then the natural question for any of us, and this is, nobody is speaking on this like a saint. We are all part of this. We are part of the problem. We need to become part of the solution. If the metaphysics is telling you you only live once, tell me what is the moral logic for delaying gratification? Why should you not consume? Why should you not accumulate? You can only delay gratification if there is a deeper principle, if there is a transcendent principle. Is it not? Which knowledge system supplies that metaphysics? How do we avoid falling into this trap of YOLO and FOMO? You only live once, therefore you are perpetually living in fear of missing out. If you only live once, then it is logical, just natural that you have to maximize. And maximize, how would you do that? By the means that culture is telling you. And what is the means that culture is giving you? It is consumption. So the crisis in education and the necessity of IKS is that there is a fundamental crisis in meaning making. And it was okay if it was restricted to some parts of the civilization as a global civilization, while others were able to work with nature and let it heal. But we are a globalized civilization now. Any behavioral attitude or any taste, any preference, any product that is created in one part of the world very quickly traverses all through the world today. Think about our own consumption choices. 5 years ago, those products might not even have existed. But today, they are essential part of our life. This rate of global spread is not sustainable. So on one hand, you have a theory that is about accumulation. On the other hand, you're creating technologies of distributing this desire at much faster scales into societies which did not have that. And all of this is aggregated under growth. But growth does not actually account for your well-being. Growth does not actually account for ecological damage. There is now within the Western world a very, very active movement for double materiality and triple materiality calculation of growth. It is not just about one dimension of currency or one dimension of wealth. You need to think about well-being, mental health. You need to think about ecology. All of these things have to be accounted for in your calculation of growth. The minute you calculate how much of nature you have extracted to produce that product and you deduct from the bottom line, you would see that the growth that we consider growth today will fall down. But that is the way to think about it. On one hand, you have this whole idea of sustainable development goals, and there is going to be a lot of, and it is good because it gives all of us an operational vocabulary to organize. At least it brings to the idea, it brings to the focus that there is a natural crisis and we need to do something about it. But sustainability development goals has sustainable economic growth. I think it's SDG 8. Economic growth model today is extractive. That is the generator function. It does not account for the other kinds of damage. So how is it sustainable? If your SDG itself involves a definition of growth that does not account for all the other damages that are, being populated as SDGs, you are just fooling yourself. If you look at any NGO, if you look at all the corporate work that happens in sustainability, if you look at policy making, everybody is singing the same tune. SDG पे काम कर रहे हैं, ठीक है? SDG पे क्या काम कर रहे हो? What does SDG mean? What are the systemic factors that are generating this crisis? What about education? What about human behavior? What about metaphysics that informs human behavior? There is no dialogue around this. All you think you can do is you organize a conference around this and you think you can solve SDG. It's not going to be solved. It is data. SDG replaced MDG about 7 years ago. In the last 7 years, and think about this, 170 countries have come together, all of them have pledged their goals, tremendous amount of intellectual energy, capital, public attention, executive commitment, everything has gone in. In the last 5 years, since we have adopted SDG, we have not made progress on even one of the goals. In fact, we've negated. We've gone in the opposite direction at a much faster clip. Compare SDG 15 data with 22 data, you will see this. Our crisis has increased. What does it tell you? It tells you that this framing is not working. It tells you that you are just like the frog in the well. And it is the role of academia, it is the role of teachers to get us all out of that well. This is why IKS is important, because it has a different metaphysics for meaning making, which is necessary for our own sustainability. This is for our own kids. We are not doing it for anybody else. We are all simultaneously teachers and parents. Right? So we are doing it for. The last one is crisis of knowledge. Crisis of knowledge because we don't know what to do without. So yes, we realize that there is a problem, there is a paradox in talking about economic growth and ecology in the same way without actually changing anything. But we do not know an alternate means. That is a crisis of knowledge. That is a crisis of epistemology. That is a crisis of praxis. That is why we are talking about IKS. The urgency that all of us need to have and the personal commitment that we need to make is that this knowledge has the source to address those problems. And therefore, if we engage with it, if you are able to create courses, if you are able to build new discipline thought on it, if you are able to build leadership around it, it is actually coming back to us as the thing that we can put out there, also helping us. So that's the proposition that I wish to make. When we think about the vision of education, NEP, how do we register that in IKS? It is that we are at an evolutionary tipping point. We do not have the intellectual means anymore to deal with the complexity that we have ourselves created. It needs a different kind of growth. That growth is internal. That is going to come from the principles of consciousness and awareness. And Bharatiya Jnana Parampara has the best meditation on the subject of inner growth. And that is where education has to lead to. So what does it mean for faculty? I've sort of alluded to this. It is a greater responsibility. It is not just about what it can do to advance our own aspirations, our own career. All of that are important. You cannot divorce yourself from that. That is existential reality. But like that trip to the ashram, every teacher who is working on his or her discipline also need to think about the larger problems. That is, to me, my understanding of a multidiscipline mind. If NEP is talking about a multidiscipline mind and talking about indigenous solutions to that, it is asking us to take on a higher responsibility. And that is an act of commitment, first of all. Beyond anything else, it is an act of vision. It is an act of internally establishing this goal and this role for ourselves. So my earnest appeal to all teachers is be the purveyors of truth. Establish this vision in our hearts and minds that we need to produce knowledge that can help the humanity deal with the challenges that we've created. If academia does not do it, don't expect that from politics. Simply, do not expect that. That is a far more competitive field. That is a far more dangerous field. That is a far more risky field. Why will they do it? So if we haven't challenged, if we haven't written about what health is, if we haven't written about how certain other treatments can be there, if we haven't used our own knowledge systems to say this is effective, then don't expect that to translate into a policy.
Don't expect the pharma lobby to change. The change has to begin with people who are producing knowledge, who are responsible for producing knowledge. So that's the context of NEP, faculty, and so on, right? So I guess, just sort of summing it up, is the fundamental principle that must drive all other disciplines. It should take all multi and transdisciplinary approaches that NEP also talks about and integrate, just the way we've seen with DCBS, it has to integrate all forms of knowledge available to us. And we need to understand what the macro trends are. Why has the world become complex? Why has the world become volatile? Why have we created a world where we are pushing our children into feeling of loneliness? Loneliness is one of the global grand challenges today. We are a 10 billion civilization and lonely. Lonely Planet is a popular channel. How? And I can't understand for the life of me how this can be a concept in India. There is just so much to engage in India. You just go out, you have everything to actually consume your attention. How can you be lonely? It is because there is an inner void, and education is not able to fill that void. There is an epidemic of drugs, prescription drugs. Anybody who studied the Western society in the last 15-20 years, if you look at the campuses in Bharat today, you will know. At a formative stage when education is supposed to give you resilience, immunity against all the vagaries that life will inevitably throw at us, it is pushing us into submission. We've created environments here which do not offer any means for our children to overcome the natural compulsions. In fact, we are encouraging those. How is that education? Are you not able to see the second order effects of that? One, why are we seeing increased divorces? Why are we seeing the pressure on families? Family is, in our own tradition, what we call a civilization, that is the bedrock of a civilization. And that is being attacked both willfully and unwittingly. That is the role of people who are engaged in social sciences to come back to what holds a civilization. And this research has to come from an IKS perspective. Because it is about the mind. It is about being able to control our natural tendencies and channelize them towards higher possibilities. And it is this system that has given you and me that possibility. So the purpose is clear. In terms of what it means for faculty, these are just words. What is important is the intent and the ability to firstly allow ourselves to be creative, to think beyond our immediate realm that the environment gives us. We are not just a physics professor, we are not an assistant professor, we are not taking 2 sessions and being happy with that in a week. We are the shapers of destiny. We are the generators of the choice that Sri Aurobindo is talking about. He's saying we have a choice in a moment of evolutionary crisis. I would say the means to exercise that choice is teachers. In fact, in the Indian conception, the actual education is yoga, right? When you think about what is education, philosophy education, it is yoga. But yoga requires a far more stringent engagement. It is not for everyone. We are not capable. We are not at that stage. And there is also loss in Prakriti. And that is why the role of shaping that has actually shifted to education, what we see as separation in the academia today. If you think about it, all education was yoga. That's what Swami Vivekananda says. That's what the whole idea of integral education is. That is the Bharatiya vision of education is yoga. It is the ability to use yourself as the instrument. But that is not possible. We are not in that frame. We are not. There has also been colonization. There has been destruction. And it is okay to have a secular, fair view of the world, but it is important to recognize that only some of those views of the world can protect us in practicing our knowledge systems. Some do not. And we have to have this clarity. Some of the worldviews are cannibalistic, and we have to be able to say this out with moral conviction. As teachers, we have to say this. As purveyors of truth, we have to say this, right? So this is another important component of what is the responsibility and what are the challenges and how we can think about this. In this, does technology have a role? The technology comes only here. Technology does not come there. In fact, like I said, in the separation between the force that asks us to analyze and compete with the environment and nature versus the intuitive, integrative nature, both of us are within us. Both of us are within us every single day, every single moment. in the choice that we exercise. This is the lower and the higher tendencies that yoga talks about. Either we succumb to the lower tendencies or we rise up to the higher tendencies. To be able to consistently do that is yoga, that is education. That is the philosophy of education in the Indian vision, right? And to be instruments of that in helping other people do that is the role of the educator or the teacher, right? So if you look at that, we've created complexity through technology. Can we create meaning through technology? Can we create solutions through technology? Can we create a more conscious human being with the aid of technology? That is a question that we should actually reflect on. And to that, technology should become friendly to the faculty. Why do we need technology? Not because it can never replace the guru. It will, in my opinion, never replace the guru, although it increases the responsibility of the guru. If a young student today has the choice between an AI, chatbot AI, which is able to give answers in a customized manner, versus a teacher that he or she needs to go through, the teacher has to be better than the chatbot AI. And chatbot AI has the advantage of being able to parse through all the data in the world. The teacher does not. We are limited. So we have something else, that act of kindness that Seshadriji spoke about. That word of kindness, that is what will help kids come back to teachers. That is what will inspire students. These things that AI is not capable of, in terms of kindness, in terms of some kind of discerning power between what is right and what is wrong, that is where we have the advantage. But unless you engage with technology, you are going to lose out in this race. It is, right? Because the student will go to chatbot and say, help me understand with this problem, and there are 10 different answers customized. So in this context, how do we imagine the role of technology in education, and what does NEP have to say? So we have the possibilities of reimagining curriculum. We have to engage with techno-pedagogies, right? Which means, how do you situate the learner at the center and make the learning contextual, relevant, interesting and fun? And how do you use technology as a means for that? That is a question that we can ask ourselves. And can you create learning journeys that are unique? This is the Gurukula system. If we can think about it, technology can help us scale that Gurukula system in a different way, which is what is happening. Today, any programmer in India, a student, a computer sciences student, can get the lesson from the best computer sciences teacher across the world. It's all available. So they don't need to come to bigger institutions. There is a different purpose that institutions serve. One of the attempts that we are doing to solve this crisis of ethics, to solve this crisis of meaning, to try and address this crisis of knowledge, is to come up with some solutions which are grounded in Indic pedagogies. That is one of the attempts. Abhishek is here. It is his imagination, his passion to make that learning journey unique for everyone. He's calling it the Learner Company, which just illustrates the learner centricity of his imagination. And in that, what can we do? These are just features. The features can be anything. What we need is a dialogue between faculty who say, this is my problem in the classroom. Please come to us and tell us, these are the challenges that we are having. We understand what you're asking us to do. We also understand the responsibility that a teacher has. It's clearly inspiring. But we have certain challenges. And how do we come together as people within academia, as teachers, and people outside who are trying to provide solutions? How do we come together to use technology and put that in the service of learning? That is the purpose, right? We already have some ideas about it, how it can help the teacher. The whole idea is to devote technology to aid and enable the teacher. That is the purpose of what he is trying to come up with. We'll request you for some intervention, maybe an engagement, some kind of feedback from you on what would you like technology to do for you. And all of that becomes the kind of roadmap that our product can have. And together we can build this. So I'll stop here, just summarizing that there is a crisis, and the crisis is one of philosophy. Indian knowledge systems has that philosophy to deal with complexity, and that reign to actually use that is in the hands of teachers. And for that, teachers need to come out of the existing structures and modes of thought and reaffirm their role as the seekers of truth and the providers of truth. And to do that, you have an education policy as a cover, which can facilitate some kind of creative visualization, and you can make technology your ally. And we are willing to partner with any faculty who wants to do this, and we will walk together on this journey to create technology in service of the teacher. Thank you.